On a cold, late November morning, Greenwood Memorial Hospital felt suspended between seasons, the last traces of autumn clinging to the windows while winter settled quietly over Burlington, Vermont. Inside the maternity wing, warm light cut through the gray as a young woman labored through the final moments of childbirth. The delivery team moved with easy coordination, relieved when a clear newborn cry finally filled the room. Someone let out a soft laugh. Another murmured, "That's a strong set of lungs." A nurse playfully called the tiny girl a future soprano. There was an air of gentle celebration, one of those rare moments when the world felt kind. But the new mother didn't respond. She didn't reach out. She didn't even glance toward the baby placed briefly on her chest. Her eyes stayed fixed on some distant point beyond the ceiling lights, as if she were listening to a voice no one else could hear. The attending nurse paused, concern tightening her expression. She lifted the infant again, swaddled her carefully, and carried her toward the nursery. "We'll let her rest," she whispered, though her worry was unmistakable. Inside the nursery, the baby girl settled quickly, her tiny fist drifting toward her mouth until she found her thumb. Olivia Benson, a 24-year-old hospital aide finishing her overnight shift, noticed the movement as she walked by with a cart of linens. Something about the child's calmness drew her closer. When Olivia leaned in, the baby opened her eyes, dark, serious, far more focused than Olivia expected from a minutes-old infant. And then the impossible happened. The baby held her gaze. It wasn't a fleeting newborn flicker. It was direct, almost searching, as if the child were trying to memorize her face. A warm ache spread through Olivia's chest before she even understood why. She whispered, "Hey there!" barely audible through the quiet hum of machines. The infant's fingers curled around her own, impossibly small and warm. A commotion stirred outside. Olivia stepped back as the mother from earlier drifted out of her room, unsteady on her feet, asking a passing nurse where she could get some water. The nurse pointed toward the hydration station, and the woman nodded weakly before shuffling down the hallway. She never returned. Minutes passed. A nurse checked the room and frowned at the empty bed. Another staff member hurried by, whispering that the mother's belongings were missing. Soon the hallway filled with the purposeful movement of nurses, residents, and clerks trying to retrace steps, confirm records, and understand what had happened. Their voices were low but tense. Olivia stood at the nursery window, her hand still resting lightly on the edge of the crib. The baby watched her with that same unblinking concentration, thumb tucked between her lips. Something inside Olivia shifted, an instinct she couldn't name, a feeling that the quiet child was at the center of a storm no one else could see. She didn't know what was wrong yet, but she knew something was. Olivia stepped quietly into the mother's room, hoping the woman had simply gone to wash her face or clear her thoughts. But the moment she crossed the threshold, her breath caught. The bed was empty. The thin hospital blanket lay folded neatly at the foot, untouched. The plastic visitor's chair was bare. The small duffel bag the woman had arrived with was gone. And across the room, the window stood open just enough for a draft of cold Vermont air to seep in, stirring the curtain. It didn't take medical training to understand what this meant. She fled. Before Olivia could alert anyone, a chime sounded overhead, followed by the clipped, apologetic voice of the charge nurse. "Attention staff, our patient tracking system is temporarily down. All newborns must be manually confirmed and accounted for. Please proceed with physical verification immediately." The hallway erupted into motion. Footsteps hushed conversations, the soft thud of binders being opened. Olivia's pulse quickened. A supervising nurse strode toward the nursery and glanced inside, her eyes moving quickly from crib to crib. She paused at the one holding the baby girl. "This crib accounted for?" the nurse asked. Olivia felt something seize inside her, panic, instinct she couldn't tell. She had no reason to speak, no authority to answer. But the words slipped out before she could stop them. "Yes," she said. "She's accounted for." The nurse nodded and moved on. Olivia stood frozen, heat flooding her face. Why had she said that? She wasn't sure. She only knew that the moment the nurse walked away, her heart was pounding hard enough to shake her. She turned to the infant again. The baby lay quietly, thumb against her cheek, dark eyes open and steady. When Olivia leaned closer, the child seemed to focus on her with unsettling clarity, the same way she had earlier, as if the two of them were the only stillness inside the building's rising chaos. Around them, staff scrambled to reconcile charts, count cribs, and piece together which records were lost during the system failure. The missing mother's forms, admissions paperwork, ID scans, medical history were nowhere to be found. In the mounting confusion, Olivia felt the world narrow to a single, fragile point, the baby watching her with impossible calm. She knew she should report the disappearance. She knew the protocol, but she also knew, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that if she spoke now, the child would be swept into a process she might never emerge from whole. Her hands trembled on the crib rail. A thought, reckless, wild, unmistakably hers, took shape at the edge of her mind, and though she wasn't ready to name it yet, the decision had already begun to form. Before this strange morning unraveled into uncertainty, Olivia's life had been defined by steadiness, quiet routines, long shifts, small hopes she carried close. She worked part-time at Greenwood Memorial while pushing through her nursing coursework, often studying in the hospital cafeteria during breaks, highlighting textbooks with tired determination. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the path she believed in, a life built from care, patience, and purpose. 3 years earlier, during a late shift at a roadside diner outside Burlington, she met Mark Benson. He was a long-haul driver who spent most weeks moving through the New England corridor, hauling timber and construction supplies between Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. Mark was the kind of man who spoke gently even when he was exhausted, who tipped well even when he shouldn't, who noticed when someone needed a moment to breathe. Olivia had brought him a refill of coffee. He'd asked if she ever took a break. She'd laughed, and somehow that turned into a conversation that lasted an hour. Their courtship was quick, effortless really. Mark admired her drive, her humor, the quiet resilience she didn't realize she carried. Olivia admired the steadiness in him, a sense of reliability she'd never found elsewhere. Within months they were inseparable, and by the end of that year, they exchanged vows in a small ceremony behind a Methodist church, surrounded by maple trees just beginning to turn gold. It was simple, heartfelt, and entirely theirs. Their marriage had been gentle and warm from the start. Mark was often on the road, but always returned with stories, with small gestures, with the kind of love that showed itself in everyday acts. Olivia, in turn, brought stability and softness to their home. But beneath that warmth lay a quiet ache they never fully spoke aloud. They had tried for children. They had hoped, waited, measured months by late periods and negative tests. Doctors assured them there was still time. Many couples struggle at first, they said, but each year that passed left a heavier silence in its wake. Olivia often told herself she was fine, that she had time, that motherhood might come later. And yet there it was, a longing she carried like a pulse beneath the rest of her life. Now, standing in the corridor outside the nursery, that ache sharpened. She eased the door open and stepped inside again. The baby lay sleeping, her tiny chest rising and falling beneath a soft, white blanket. The room hummed with warm air, a faint lullaby from a nearby radio drifting in and out. Olivia approached the crib, unable to stay away. Something in her, something long dormant, stirred and widened. The pull toward the child was stronger now, as if the baby's quiet presence pressed against a hollow space in her heart that had been waiting for years. The hospital had dissolved into controlled disorder. Nurses walking briskly from crib to crib, clerks attempting to rebuild missing charts by hand, and supervisors calling out instructions to keep the maternity wing from slipping into chaos. In the midst of it all, Olivia stood beside the newborn's crib, feeling the moment press in on her from all sides. She knew the protocols, the expectations, the consequences, and yet something deeper, older, almost instinctive, rose above all of it. Before she had time to think her way out of it, she reached for an extra blanket from the warming drawer. Her hands shook as she wrapped the baby gently, tucking the edges close around her small body. The infant stirred only slightly, then settled against her chest as if the movement were expected. Olivia looked around. Staff were distracted, heads bent over clipboards, voices low and urgent. The tracking system failure had pulled everyone in a dozen directions at once, and for one impossible sliver of time, the world offered her a path she never could have imagined taking. She stepped toward the service hallway. Each footfall felt too loud, though the corridor was muffled and empty. She pressed the bar on the back exit door, and a gust of sharp Vermont cold rushed in. The air bit at her cheeks, stung the corners of her eyes, and filled her lungs with something that felt almost like fear and freedom tangled together. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. But no one called after her. No one rushed out to stop her. No one seemed to notice the aide with the bundled infant walking swiftly across the parking lot toward an older blue sedan, still dusted with frost. She opened the driver's side door, eased into the seat, and placed the baby carefully in her lap while she started the engine. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she pulled away from the hospital. Every glance in the rearview mirror expecting lights, sirens, someone running toward her. But nothing came. By the time she reached her small apartment tucked behind a row of old maples, her hands had steadied enough to unlock the door. She carried the child inside and laid her gently on the couch, the soft cushions dipping under the weight of her tiny body. Olivia knelt beside her, studying the baby's delicate features, the faint swirl of hair, the tiny fists, the impossibly calm expression. When she went to change out of her hospital scrubs, she noticed something glinting beneath the collar of the baby's blanket. She leaned closer and uncovered a small pendant hanging from a thin cord, a copper oak leaf with a tiny emerald droplet at its tip. It was unlike anything she'd ever seen on an infant. Old-fashioned, expensive, carefully crafted, a piece that didn't belong in a maternity ward, a family heirloom. Olivia touched it gently, her fingertips brushing the cool metal, a chill running through her despite the warmth of the apartment. Whatever this child had come from, whoever she belonged to, this pendant was the key. Olivia paced the length of the living room, her mind unraveling faster than she could steady it. Every thought collided with the next. How would she ever explain this to Mark? What would he think when he walked through the door and found a newborn on their couch? What would CPS say if the hospital discovered the baby missing before she could explain what happened? What if they treated her like someone dangerous, someone unhinged? The questions came too fast, piling into panic. She pressed her palms to her forehead, trying to slow her breathing. The baby made a soft sigh, the kind of tiny sound that shouldn't have had the power to cut through fear, yet somehow did. Olivia looked down at the child, so small, so helpless, and her resolve wavered again. She didn't regret bringing her home. She regretted not knowing what to do next. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She called the only person who could ground her. "Mom, can you come? Please, right now. It's an emergency." Linda Benson arrived within 15 minutes, coat half buttoned, keys still clutched in her fist. The moment she stepped inside, her gaze fell on the infant lying on a folded blanket on the couch. Her breath hitched. "Oh my God, Olivia, what did you do?" Her voice rose with alarm, her hand flying to her chest. Did you take someone's baby?" "Olivia, honey, this is a crime." The panic in her mother's eyes nearly made Olivia collapse. "No. Mom, listen, just listen," she begged, guiding her toward the kitchen table before she could spiral further. Olivia rushed through the entire story: the birth, the mother who wouldn't look at her child, the sudden disappearance, the system failure, the moment she froze when the nurse asked if the baby was accounted for, and the pull she couldn't ignore. Linda blinked hard, trying to process it all. Fear warred with something softer in her expression. "Olivia, this is illegal," she whispered, voice shaking. But her eyes drifted back to the infant. And yet, look at her. The poor thing had no one. They both turned when the baby fussed. Instinct took over. Linda warmed a bottle while Olivia held the tiny girl, guiding the nipple toward her searching mouth. The baby drank greedily, her small fingers curling around Olivia's thumb. When she finished, they changed her into a softer blanket, one of Olivia's spares from a box in the closet. Linda smiled faintly as the baby settled. "She needs a name, at least for now." "Alice," Olivia whispered. "She feels like an Alice." Before Linda left, she cupped her daughter's face gently. "This isn't sustainable, Olivia. Sooner or later, you'll have to make a decision. But maybe this happened for a reason. Don't ignore that." The door clicked shut, leaving Olivia alone with Alice, and the weight of what came next. Mark returned just after sunrise, the rumble of his truck fading as he pulled into their driveway. Olivia heard the familiar clatter of his boots on the porch steps, a sound that usually brought comfort. This morning, it made her stomach twist. She stood in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter, rehearsing explanations she still didn't know how to give. The door opened. Mark stepped inside, tired from a week on the road, but smiling when he saw her, until the smile faltered. He studied her face, reading the tension she hadn't managed to hide. "Liv, you okay?" His voice was gentle, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. He set down his duffel, wiped his hands on his jacket, and walked toward the living room. Olivia followed, heart pounding so loudly she barely heard his footsteps. When he rounded the corner and saw the tiny bundle sleeping on their couch, he stopped so abruptly that Olivia almost ran into him. What is that?" he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make the scene unravel. "A baby," she said, though the word felt absurdly insufficient. Mark stared, confusion deepening into shock. "Whose baby is that, Olivia?" Her breath broke. Everything she had been holding inside since the night before untangled at once. She told him everything: the birth, the mother's strange detachment, her disappearance, the system failure, the panic, the decision she couldn't fully explain. Her voice shook, words tripping over each other as she tried to make him understand something she barely understood herself. When she finished, Mark dragged a hand over his face. "Liv, this is serious. You can't just take a baby home because something felt wrong. We have to call someone. CPS, the hospital, somebody." "I know," she whispered, though the words rang hollow. "I know, but no," he cut in, his tone firm but not unkind. "She's not ours. We need to do the right thing before this gets worse." Olivia swallowed, fighting panic. She reached for the small blanket wrapped around Alice and gently lifted the pendant she'd found earlier, a copper oak leaf with a tiny emerald droplet at its tip. She placed it carefully in Mark's hand. He glanced down, intending to dismiss it as irrelevant, but the moment his eyes landed on the pendant, everything in him stilled. The color drained from his face. His fingers closed around it instinctively, as if trying to confirm it was real. Slowly he lifted his gaze to Olivia, shock widening in his expression into something deeper: recognition. "Olivia!" His voice was barely audible. "Where did you get this?" The room fell silent around them, the question hanging heavily in the air, shifting everything they thought they knew. Mark didn't answer her right away. Instead, still gripping the pendant as though afraid it might disappear, He turned and walked quickly down the hall toward the coat closet. Olivia followed, her pulse thudding in her ears. He dropped to one knee, shoved aside a stack of winter boots, and pulled out a plastic storage bin labeled family keepsakes. Dust clung to the lid. He tore it open with trembling hands. Inside lay an assortment of old holiday cards, yellowing letters, and a photo album bound in fading blue fabric. Mark lifted it carefully, as if it were something fragile, and carried it to the dining table. Olivia stood beside him, watching the tension in his shoulders. He flipped through page after page until he reached a section of photographs from his mother's 20s, images Olivia had never seen. There, in the middle of a page, was a picture of Margaret Benson, standing in front of an old farmhouse bench, smiling with an ease Mark hadn't seen in years. And around her neck, gleaming even in the washed-out colors of the print, hung a copper oak leaf pendant with a tiny emerald droplet. The same pendant, the same shape, the same engraved veins, the same distinctive greenstone. Olivia felt her breath leave her in one sharp exhale. The room seemed to tilt slightly as she looked from the photo to the pendant in Mark's hand. "She told me she lost it," Mark murmured. "Years ago. I must have been 7 or 8. She said it had been passed down from mother to daughter for generations." His voice tightened. "She always said it was the only heirloom that survived after her grandmother died." Olivia glanced toward the living room, where the baby slept unaware of the storm swirling around her. "Mark, do you think—" He shook his head, but not in denial, more like disbelief. "I don't know. I don't know how this could be possible." He looked again at the photograph, then at the pendant, then at Olivia. "But that," he said, voice unsteady, "is the same piece. My mom wore it constantly when she was younger." A heavy silence settled between them. If Margaret's pendant now rested on the neck of an abandoned newborn, one Olivia happened to pick up on the exact day the child's mother fled, what did that mean? What connection could possibly exist between a stranger who vanished and a family heirloom missing for decades? The questions came faster than answers. Olivia whispered, "We need to talk to your parents." Mark's expression hardened with decision. "Yeah," he said, closing the album gently but firmly. "We're going. Right now." Neither of them fully understood what they were stepping into. They only knew the truth wasn't waiting for them in their apartment. It was waiting at the Benson house. Olivia and Mark drove in near silence, the winter-gray Burlington streets blurring past the windshield. Neither knew how to prepare for the conversation ahead. When they pulled into the Benson driveway, a modest colonial with smoke curling from the chimney, Olivia felt her heartbeat climb into her throat. They hadn't called first. The front door opened before they reached the porch. Margaret Benson stepped out in a cardigan and house slippers, her husband, Robert, behind her. Both wore matching expressions of confusion. "Mark?" "Olivia?" "What on earth?" Margaret began. Then her gaze dropped to the infant carrier in Mark's hand. Her face shifted instantly. Shock, suspicion, something sharper. "Olivia, sweetheart, did you have a baby? And not tell us?" Robert frowned, glancing between them. "If this is some kind of surprise, it's not funny." "It's not ours," Mark said immediately. "Mom, Dad, please sit down. We need to talk." They ushered them inside to the living room. Olivia held Alice close, rocking her gently while Mark reached into his coat pocket. He approached his mother slowly, as if afraid she might break. "Mom," he said quietly, "I need you to look at something." He placed the pendant in her palm. The moment Margaret's eyes registered what she was holding, all color drained from her face. Her lips parted soundlessly, and she swayed. "Margaret." Robert caught her just as her knees buckled. Mark rushed forward, helping guide her onto the couch. Olivia set Alice in her carrier and hurried to fetch water. It took nearly a full minute for Margaret to open her eyes. When she saw the pendant lying on the coffee table, she began to tremble. "No," she whispered. "No, it can't be." "Mom," Mark said softly, "you need to tell us what this is." She pressed a shaking hand over her mouth. Her eyes glossed with tears before a single word slipped out, raw, broken. "I knew this day would come." Robert stiffened. "What day?" "Margaret, what are you talking about?" Her composure collapsed. She sank back against the cushions, tears spilling freely as 25 years of silence cracked open. "Before you and I reconciled," she whispered to Robert, "when we separated, I met someone. It wasn't serious, I thought. But then I found out I was pregnant. You and I were barely speaking, and I was terrified." Mark felt the air leave his lungs. "I didn't have support," Margaret continued. "I had you, Mark. Barely a little boy, and no one else. I didn't know how to raise 2 children alone. So after she was born," her voice broke, "I left her at the hospital. I couldn't bear to leave her with nothing. So I gave her the only heirloom I had, the pendant. I thought maybe someday she'd find someone who could help her trace it back." Robert stared at her, stunned and wounded. "You had a daughter? You never told me." "I wanted to," she cried, "every day. But the longer I kept it, the harder it became. I convinced myself that stirring up the past would only bring more pain." Mark felt dizzy, gripping the edge of a chair. "So, I have a sister." Margaret nodded weakly. "A little girl I never got to hold twice. I've lived with that regret for 25 years. Olivia swallowed hard, glancing at the sleeping baby whose fate had called all of them into the same room. The pendant, the missing mother, the impossible timing. It no longer felt like coincidence at all. The house felt unbearably quiet after Margaret's confession, as though the walls themselves were struggling to absorb the weight of what had been spoken aloud. Robert sat rigidly in his armchair, processing the revelation of a daughter he never knew existed. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a trembling hand. Mark paced, trying to make sense of the tangled branches of a suddenly reshaped family tree. Olivia held Alice close, her heart pounding with something that felt equal parts dread and clarity. At last Mark stopped pacing. "We have to find her," he said, voice steadying with purpose. "Mom's daughter, my sister, whoever raised her, whoever she grew up to be, we need to find her." Margaret nodded, still shaken. Her birth records would have been at Old North Maternity. "It's the only place I could have delivered." Olivia's pulse quickened. "I'll go," she said before she had time to second-guess herself. "Let me check the hospital. Maybe someone there knows something, or there are old records, something that can help." Robert frowned. "Are you sure you should go alone?" Olivia glanced down at Alice, sleeping peacefully against her chest. "Yes, I started this by taking her home. I should be the one to follow the thread." Before leaving, they made a stop at a baby supply store. Mark grabbed diapers while Olivia selected bottles, formula, and a new carrier. Margaret, still pale, added soft blankets to the cart, stroking the fabric as though apologizing silently for the decades she could never give her first daughter. By the time they loaded everything into the car, Alice was bundled securely, the faintest hint of milk still on her lips. Old North Maternity Hospital sat on the northern edge of Burlington, its brick facade weathered with age. The newer medical center had replaced it in recent years, leaving this building partially converted but still housing a few outpatient services. Olivia parked near the entrance, her nerves tightening as she stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. Inside, the lobby was quiet. The scent of disinfectant lingered faintly under the hum of fluorescent lights. To her right, an old bulletin board caught her eye, its cork faded, corners peeling. The header read, "Staff Memories Through the Years." Photographs, decades old, were pinned in uneven rows, nurses laughing in break rooms, Doctors posing at retirement parties, holiday potlucks with garlands taped sloppily along the walls. Then one image froze her. A woman, no, a teenage girl, maybe 16 or 17, stood beside a smiling older nurse. And around the girl's neck hung a copper oak leaf pendant with a tiny emerald droplet. The same pendant, the same piece that now sat beside Alice's crib. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as the realization struck her. This girl wasn't a staff member. She was Margaret's daughter, and she had been here. A door opened somewhere behind Olivia, and a nurse in light blue scrubs stepped out, rubbing sanitizer between her palms. She followed Olivia's gaze to the faded bulletin board. "You looking for someone in those old photos?" she asked kindly. Olivia pointed to the teenage girl with the pendant. "Do you know who she is?" The nurse squinted, then nodded. "Oh, her. That's Emily Harper. She used to come around with her mother, Dr. Helen Harper. She worked here for years before moving to the main campus." Olivia's heart jolted. "Is Dr. Harper still practicing?" "Of course. She's in the outpatient wing down the hall. Want me to show you?" Olivia could only nod. The nurse led her through a short corridor to a door with a brass plaque. Helen Harper, MD. Obstetrics and Women's Health. Olivia hesitated only a second before knocking. "Come in," a warm but tired voice called. Dr. Helen Harper looked to be in her late 50s. Her silver-streaked hair pulled neatly into a bun. She smiled professionally until Olivia stepped forward and set the copper oak leaf pendant gently on her desk. The doctor's face drained of color. Her hand rose instinctively toward her chest, as if the pendant had once hung there. She picked it up with trembling fingers, turning it over, tracing the familiar engraved veins and the emerald droplet. Where did you get this?" she whispered. "From a newborn abandoned yesterday at Greenwood Memorial," Olivia said softly. "The baby's mother left it with her." Helen closed her eyes, pain flickering across her features. When she opened them again, her voice had dropped to a thin thread. "I haven't seen this pendant in 25 years. Olivia stayed silent, letting her speak. "When I worked here," Helen continued, "there was a baby girl left in the nursery without a name. Her mother disappeared. The hospital followed protocol. But something about the child, something about the pendant, made me feel she deserved a home, not the system. I adopted her." Her voice broke. "I named her Emily." Olivia swallowed. Emily just gave birth. Helen's world seemed to stop. "No," she said, shaking her head. "No, she told me she miscarried. Months ago. She was devastated. I thought." Her voice cracked, hands covering her mouth. "Oh God, she lied to me." Olivia leaned forward. "She didn't miscarry. She delivered a healthy baby girl yesterday. And then she ran." Tears welled instantly in Helen's eyes, spilling over before she could wipe them away. Why would she run? Why wouldn't she come to me? I would have helped her. I always tried to protect her. "She was scared," Olivia said gently. "She didn't tell her fiancé she was pregnant. She didn't tell you. She's been carrying this alone." Helen pressed the pendant to her chest, closing her eyes. "I failed her." "No," Olivia said firmly. "But she needs you now. And there is a baby, her baby, who needs all of you to talk, to face this together." Helen drew a trembling breath, nodding slowly, resolutely. "Take me to her," she whispered. Alder Street Cafe was normally a warm, quiet place where students studied and retirees lingered over pie. Today, it held 7 people bound together by a story none of them could have imagined 48 hours earlier. Olivia arrived first with Alice nestled in her carrier. Mark and his parents followed, still tense from the revelations that had shaken their family apart and stitched it back together in new, fragile ways. Helen Harper entered moments later with Emily at her side. Emily looked pale and exhausted, a young woman hollowed out by shame, fear, and sleeplessness. Her eyes darted immediately to the infant carrier, then away again, as if the sight burned. Everyone sat. No one spoke at first. It was Emily who finally broke the silence. Her hands twisted in her lap, fingers knotted tightly together. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said, her voice splintering. I didn't even know where to start explaining. Helen touched her daughter's shoulder gently. Emily inhaled shakily. "A little over a year ago," she began, "I was seeing someone. It wasn't serious, but I thought he cared. Then he disappeared. Completely. Ghosted me. I felt stupid and used." She swallowed hard. "And then I met Matthew. He was kind, steady, everything that man wasn't. I fell for him fast." Across the table, Margaret and Robert listened silently, their faces filled with a mixture of empathy and heartbreak for the daughter they had never known. "When I found out I was pregnant," Emily continued, "I'd already been with Matthew for months. I panicked. I thought if he knew it wasn't his baby, he'd leave. I told him I'd miscarried. And when I told Mom," she looked at Helen with trembling guilt, "I lied to her too. I said the same thing. I just couldn't face disappointing everyone." Helen's eyes glistened. "Honey, you wouldn't have disappointed me." Emily covered her face. "I was ashamed, and when the contractions started, I hid it. I drove to Greenwood Memorial, praying I'd be in and out without anyone I knew seeing me." Tears slipped through her fingers, but after she was born, after they put her on my chest, I froze. I couldn't even look at her. I felt like the worst person alive, and when the nurse left the room, I ran. A chair scraped suddenly. Matthew Collins had approached quietly, but now stood a few feet away, having heard everything. His jaw was tight, his eyes unreadable. "Emily," he said softly, "I need a minute." He stepped outside. Emily broke into sobs, convinced she had lost him forever. Helen folded her into her arms, while Olivia gently rocked Alice, who stirred against the rising emotion around her. Minutes passed, long, painful minutes, before the cafe door opened again. Matthew walked back in slowly, his face calmer now. In his hand was a small pink baby rattle he must have bought from the boutique next door. He set it gently on the table in front of Emily. "I'm not walking away," he said. "I needed a second to breathe, but I love you. And if she's part of you," he glanced at Alice, "then she's part of me too. I want to be here. For both of you." Emily's sob broke into a disbelieving laugh. She reached for Alice with trembling arms. Olivia loosened the carrier straps and lifted the baby into her mother's embrace. For the first time, Emily held her daughter without fear. Alice blinked up at her, tiny fingers curling against her chest as if recognizing the heartbeat she had known before birth. Emily bowed her head over the infant, tears dripping onto the blanket. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." No one at the table spoke. They simply watched as a secret unraveled. A family reshaped itself. And a mother finally claimed her child. The air inside Alder Street Cafe had shifted, where tension once pressed into every corner. A gentler stillness settled, a fragile, trembling quiet that felt like the first breath after a long storm. Emily continued to cradle Alice, murmuring soft apologies and promises into her daughter's hair. Helen sat beside her, one hand stroking Emily's back, the other resting protectively on Alice's tiny foot. A mother comforting a daughter, and a grandmother learning the shape of a new generation. "I thought you didn't trust me," Helen whispered, voice cracking. Emily shook her head fiercely. "I just didn't trust myself." Helen pulled her close. "You were never alone, not really. And you won't be now." Across the table, Margaret Benson watched with an expression worn by decades of guilt. Tears slid down her cheeks before she even tried to speak. "Emily," she whispered, "you don't know me. You owe me nothing. But I loved you. Even when I believed I couldn't keep you, I loved you." Emily looked up, eyes wide and wet. You're my biological mother. Margaret nodded, trembling. I wanted to tell someone for years. I wanted to find you, but I was afraid of reopening wounds I deserved to live with. Helen reached across the table, placing her hand over Margaret's. No blâme, only compassion for the woman who had carried a secret heavier than anyone knew. Emily took Margaret's other hand. You didn't abandon me. You gave me to someone who could take care of me. And you left the pendant, so a part of you stayed. Margaret bowed her head and sobbed, quiet, grateful, relieved. Mark sat stunned beside Olivia, the revelation settling into him slowly. I have a sister, he murmured, as if testing the truth out loud. And a niece. Olivia smiled softly. You do. She looked down at Alice, now sleeping against Emily's chest, her tiny breaths warming the fabric of her mother's sweater. Olivia felt a tug in her heart, love, protectiveness, and something bittersweet. She had carried this child out of the hospital believing she was saving her. She now understood she had delivered her home. Gently, Olivia reached over and brushed Alice's blanket into place. She belongs with you, she said to Emily. I was just keeping her safe until you were ready. Emily's eyes filled again. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Talk shifted to practical matters. Helen assured them she would contact the hospital, child services, and a family attorney. Everything will be handled the right way, she promised. Legally, respectfully, with love. No one doubted her. Eventually, the group began to drift toward the exit, conversations softening into reassurance, forgiveness, and tentative plans for the future. When Olivia and Mark stepped outside, the cold Vermont evening wrapped around them. Crisp, quiet, almost unreal. Mark slipped his arm around her shoulders. Can you believe any of this? Olivia shook her head, breath forming clouds in the darkening air. One baby, she whispered. One abandoned child. And it connected 3 families. As they walked toward their car, she glanced through the cafe window one last time. Inside, under warm lights, Alice slept peacefully in her mother's arms. The tiny thread that had rewoven lives, unearthed long-buried secrets, healed old wounds, and rewritten destinies that had been drifting apart for decades. And in that small cafe on a winter evening, a new family began.